Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Welcome, and welcome back for those of you who joined us this morning. The afternoon program has, like the morning, two speakers, one each for an hour, each one of which will speak for about 30 minutes, after which we have about 30 minutes for discussion. We're starting just a few minutes late on our third distinguished speaker, so it's okay if we sort of push back the entire program by 5 or 10 minutes or so, since we're not rushed by any pressing obligation this afternoon. So I'd now like to introduce Tasha Ramos, who is a second-year graduate student at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies in the Social Sciences Division, who focuses on language politics in Tunisia, who will introduce our third speaker.
Thank you. Director at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, the distinguished professor at Utrecht University, Dr. Peter van der Veer's work focuses on religion and nationalism in Asia and Europe, on which he has published several books. He's held visiting positions at the London School of Economics, the University of Chicago, the University of Michigan, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the New School in New York, and the National University of Singapore. And that's a truncated version. Beyond merely being prolific, Dr. van der Veer is also revolutionary in his field, exemplified by his 2001 book, Imperial Encounters: Religion and Modernity in India and Britain. In this work, he challenges the conventional wisdom on British cultural hegemony. Before Imperial Encounters was published, the idea was held that Britain imposed culture and policies onto its Indian colony vis-a-vis a top-down model. What Dr. van der Veer argues for, however, is a model based on reciprocal cultural and political exchange, whereby the colony influenced the shaping of what he deems the English metropole in equal measure. Influenced by changing ideas around religion and secularity, and influenced by such factors as language and race, the work ultimately posits a shared national development in both England and India based on a shared experience of empire. Today, he will be speaking to us about his latest book, which goes beyond the Indian subcontinent, entitled The Modern Spirit of Asia: The Spiritual and the Secular in China and India. So now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter van der Veer as he discusses Keeping the Muslims Out: Concepts of Civilization, Civility, and Civil Society in India, China, and Western Europe.
Thank you very much for this very gracious introduction, which reminds me that I've been traveling too much. But not to the University of Chicago, in fact. Over the last 10 years I've not been here, but I'm happy to see it's just as cold as last time. So, and I thank Monica Ringer for inviting me to this place again, and experience also some nice encounters again with friends and colleagues who I've met in other places and who I know for a long time, Muzaffar. The issue I want to address is the problem of the stranger in society in relation to concepts of civilization, civility, and civil society. The concept of civilization has to be taken serious despite all the conceptual confusion often surrounding it. In the discussion on the European Constitution, the question of civilization loomed large. Christian Democrats pointed out that Europe was founded on a Christian civilization, while liberals and socialists pointed at the secular liberal Enlightenment foundations of Europe. Both arguments were also used against the inclusion of Muslim Turkey as a member of the EU. The fact that there were already millions of Turks as well as other Muslims in Europe seemed to have no bearing on the question whether Europe was Christian or secular liberal. The fact that Turkey has a secular state and a secularism that resembles most French laïcité, also did not have a bearing on the discussion of the inclusion of Muslim Turkey. This civilizational debate shows the extent to which Muslims are defined as strangers in Europe. The Bharatiya Janata Party in India constantly points at Hindu civilization as foundational to India. To be an Indian is to be a Hindu, while the secular Congress Party has a more inclusive but still quite Hindu understanding of Indian civilization as laid out in Nehru's book The Discovery of India. Like in Europe, the Muslim is the significant stranger, despite the presence of Islam in South Asia for almost as long as Islam exists. Even in China, the communists have rediscovered Confucianism as the basis of Chinese civilization. Following an old pattern of thinking, different religions should submit to the harmonious order controlled by the Chinese state. Here, the strangers are either Uyghur Muslims or Christians, routinely seen as foreign, as not belonging to the civilization. Now, as one knows, one of the most disturbing recent, or not so recent anymore, but important theoretical applications of the concept of civilization has been that of the late Samuel Huntington in his Clash of Civilizations, in which he argued that global conflict arises out of the clash of civilizations that culturally divide the world. These civilizations are, in his account, one is Western, second Latin American, third Islamic, fourth Sinic, which means Chinese, fifth Hindu, sixth Orthodox, seven Japanese, and eight the African. This is a really interesting kind of summing up of the civilizations of the world. I'm pretty sure Chicago still has a CIF course, right? Yeah. So what is seen as civilization and what therefore requires some understanding in these courses is always interesting. The core of these civilizations is formed by religious traditions. If we look at the regions we discuss here, this theory of international relations does not sound very convincing. Pakistan and Bangladesh were together after independence because of shared religion, but later split because of ethnicity. China and Vietnam had a war in the late 70s despite their common civilization and their common communism. The Irish fight each other as Catholics and Protestants within the same civilization. The only case that seems to fit the civilizational theory is that of Al-Qaeda fighting Western civilization. Al-Qaeda itself, however, is a terrorist group, not a civilization. So Huntington's theory is only partly about international relations, pleading for peaceful coexistence between civilizations, much as in Cold War containment policies, but it's mainly about the need for civilizational unity in the West, and especially the US. It's here that the problematic of the stranger who threatens the unity of a civilization comes into the foreground in thinking about civilization. While European intellectuals are worried about Muslim demographics in their societies, Huntington was in fact worried about the Hispanic demographics in the US. So the whole book is in fact, in the end, a story about the US and about the unity of American civilization. Cultural relativism abroad and cultural homogeneity at home seems also to be the message of his last book, which was entitled Who Are We? The Challenges to American Identity, which came out in 2004. The attention that has been given to Huntington's theory and also the application of some of the elements of the theory in political practice shows that the concept of civilization is very much alive in the study of international relations. Recently, Peter Katzenstein, a leading IR international relations theorist, has been arguing that, and I quote, civilizations are social and operate at the broadest level of cultural identity in world politics. Because they are culturally integrated, civilizations can assume a reified identity when encountering other civilizations, unquote. And following the sociologist Randall Collins, he sees civilizations as, and I quote, zones of prestige that have one or several cultural centers, unquote. In Katzenstein's view, India and China, as well as the US, are civilizational states. Religious traditions are central to their identity and to their civilizing projects of Indicization, Sinicization, or Americanization. A major impetus in thinking about civilization is to find deep history or even unchangeable essences. Max Weber's understanding of Western modernity is based on a theory about the rationalization of religion in Europe, which he compares with the rationalization of religion in India and China. It has inspired a group of scholars around the late Shmuel Eisenstadt to suggest a deeper history of civilizational, means religious patterns that lead to differences in their modernities. Eisenstadt argues that a disjunction, but not a split, between the transcendental and the mundane was for the first time made in a number of civilizations in roughly the same period, the first millennium before the Christian era. These civilizations include, and again this is a summing up of civilizations, ancient Israel, ancient Greece, early Christianity, Zoroastrian Iran, early imperial China, and the Hindu and Buddhist civilizations around 500 BC. Sociologically, this development assumed the emergence of intellectual elites, say Confucian literati, Brahmins, Buddhist Sangha, that wanted to shape the world in accordance with its transcendental vision. This revolution in civilizational thought that occurred in all these civilizations in a relatively short time span around 500 BC was called the Actual Age breakthroughs, using a concept developed by the philosopher Karl Jaspers after the war, who argued that in this period a shared framework for universal historical self-understanding emerged. The central idea in this theory is that in the actual age, a new emphasis on the existence of a higher transcendental moral order was developed across civilizations, as well as the concomitant emergence of the problem of salvation and immortality. How this problem is addressed differs from civilization to civilization. Jaspers and Eisenstadt's actual framework is the background to Charles Taylor's work on Western modernity, which he characterizes as a secular age. In Taylor's view, the actual diet of immanent transcendence, and these two belong to each other, was radically split in European thought from the 17th century onwards, and that split gave rise to the possibility of seeing the immanent as all there is, and to see the transcendent as a human invention, so making the secular possible, as it were. This worldly, in the Chinese case, then does not mean exactly the same as secular in the Western case. All these ultimately Weberian arguments, however, essentialize civilizational units that can be compared without sufficiently exploring the highly fragmented and contradictory histories of these societies. They also tend to underestimate the influence of thought that does not fit easily in the immanent transcendent framework, such as all those religious movements in India and China and elsewhere that emphasize the unity of being, so not a split between the transcendent and the immanent, and the denial of difference, like some of the Indian movements. Weber's comparative historical sociology itself has much in common with Hegel's philosophy of history, according to which the Geist, the rationality, develops in the West and cannot develop in the East because of a lack of individuality in India and China. In the Hegelian argument, it is in India the caste system that robs people from their individual rationality, while in China it is the overwhelming power of the state. In my view, we need to avoid these essentializations of civilization without denying the deep histories of especially religious traditions and processes of state formation that connect people over vast territories. Of great importance is to avoid the felt necessity to narrativize unity. When we look at tradition, and I think traditions are very important, we may want to use Talal Assad's definition. And I quote, this is a difficult definition, but I think it's a very enlightening definition. A tradition consists essentially of discourses that seek to instruct practitioners regarding the correct form and purpose of a given practice, that precisely because it is established has a history. These discourses relate conceptually to a past, namely when the practice was instituted, and from which the knowledge of its point and proper performance has been transmitted, and a future, how the point of that practice can best be secured in the short or long term. So it's not only conservative, right? Or why it should be modified or abandoned. And that connects the past and present, the past and the future through a present, namely how it is linked to other practices, institutions, and social conditions. So central to a tradition is therefore the debate about authenticity and transgression. So it's not a conservative thing that people have, but it is a debate that people conduct. And if they don't conduct a debate, then the tradition is dead, you can say. Traditions project themselves as timeless, transcending history, and their discursive authority lies precisely in that claim. So in traditions, you have the tendency to say, well, these things have always been like this, which is basically a discursive claim in a debate. It is thus not so much that in the modern period traditions are cast away in a process of westernization or modernization, but that the debate about how indigenous traditions relate to the necessity to measure up against the modern power of the West becomes central. And I think that was in what we have been discussing this morning about Turkey would be one of the examples of it. When we examine nationalism and modernity in India, China and Europe, we should not simply see this as a break with the traditional past, but as a reworking and transformation of traditions that are now portrayed as constituting the essence of national identity or its civilization. So there's a nationalization of culture which amounts to the idea of civilization, a national civilization, in fact. As Norbert Elias has pointed out, the term civilisation in French identifies the national characteristics of the French, while the German civilisation stands for outward, material civilization and is seen as inferior to Kultur, which is purely spiritual, rein geistig, and much less connected to politics. In the second half of the 19th century, these concepts also come to stand for essential differences between the French and the Germans, and we know what that led to. So these things are not innocent kind of ideas about these Germans or these French and so on, but they are really of political importance. This is a longer paper, in fact. Let me now turn to the concept of civility that is closely related to that of civilization. In Adam Smith's understanding of commercial society, a stranger is someone who is neither friend nor foe, but someone uninvolved, indifferent, and impartial. Commercial society depends on impartial interaction, which requires self-constraint and civility in public spaces. Smith thought that the growth of such interactions would lead to a universal sociability. So civility is necessary for commercial transactions. And this is close to Norbert Elias' interpretation of the process of civilization. According to Elias, social differentiation and longer chains of interdependence would result in regulation of conduct. While Smith emphasized market society, Elias emphasized state formation that led to pacification and a monopoly of the state on physical force. In both arguments we find a teleological causality that makes us all into strangers and requires that we can treat each other impartially and without violence. You can see that some of these older debates about getting rid of communal bonding and so on, and family bonding, is necessary for modern society. To use Albert Hirschman's classic interpretation, we lose our passions because of our interests. I find the idea that we all have to become strangers to be able to enter commercial society very interesting. It's close to the idea in modernization theory that ethnic bonds have to be replaced by civic bonds. Weak ties, or being strangers to one another, is an important element of commercial society even before modern times. When one cannot rely on family or ethnicity and has to trust complete strangers, one needs to have trust-inspiring codes of conduct. And civility and social trust are therefore closely related. In modern society, this is partly class-based. It's what one learns in high school and at the university, so we are all being civilized in the university. However, there are different spheres of civility with cognoscenti and strangers. Students of China have pointed at the importance of guanxi, practices like gift giving and banquets to establish relations between strangers. I always gain a lot of weight in China. There's a lot of dining and wining. Since much of this involves eating and drinking, Muslims with food and drinking taboos have difficulty in participating in them. This is mostly seen as the main element of a distinction between Muslims and the rest of the Chinese. You can't eat with them, so how can you actually build trust with them? However, they may be able to create their own ethnic enclaves in the business community in which civility is ethnicized and trust and solidarity grow out of the very fact of exclusion from wider commerce. So specialized traders. Indians with their caste-based food taboos can relax them during business transactions. In buffet meals, which is one of the banes of modern Indian society, the buffet, in buffet meals, both meat and vegetarian dishes are served. However, again, Muslims tend to be excluded, not so much because they eat meat, because people think they eat beef. In Europe, it is another aspect of civility, namely public appearance and behavior, that tends to exclude Muslims as strangers. It's in the anonymity of the city that, according to Simmel, we are all strangers. Public civility is imposed on everyone to be able to be in each other's face in public transport or shopping malls. Here, civility is in an interesting way connected to indifference or ways of not seeing. Strangers have to acquire these forms of conduct to be able to become invisible. It's here that especially dressing codes are crucial. In Europe, the visibility of difference, especially of a gendered nature, of Muslims in the public sphere is one of the main issues in politics. I hardly have to mention the importance of covering one's head in modesty for debates about inclusion or exclusion of Muslims. Muslim modesty is interpreted as obscenity, as uncivil behavior that signifies the subjugation of women in modern society, in which equality, individuality and liberty are the guiding values. And there's a lot of passion in these kinds of arguments, and you hear them constantly and everywhere. Finally, let me say a few things about civil society. This is generally understood as an aspect of modern civilization. In accounts by Norbert Elias and Roger Chartier, civility is the code of behavior that is required in the new free spaces of communication of citizens, those who belong to the political community. Civil society refers to voluntary associations outside of state control, and thus the possibility of the free exchange of ideas which constitutes the public sphere. Theorists like Habermas, Rawls and Taylor have all attempted to describe the nature of civil society and also to prescribe the nature of communication in civil society. Since the 1980s, much of the critique of the twin concepts of civil society and public sphere has focused on who have been excluded from it, say women, blacks, etc. A major element of the arguments of John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas has been that the public sphere has to be completely secular to be neutrally accessible to all. These are arguments not about the content of the debate, but about procedures of conducting a rational debate and creating an overlapping consensus. but still they depend on the secular as the frame of any debate. This is even true for later reformulations of their position. Rawls argues later that religious arguments could have a place in the debate as long as they were translatable in secular terms. Habermas argues nowadays, well, totally uninterested in religion before, but religion seems to be still there. So Habermas argues that they are permissible, religious argument, and can even be helpful as long as there is no direct appeal to a transcendent notion of ultimate truth. Charles Taylor has responded to this by putting forward that Habermas' own demand of complete rationality is, in fact, a claim to a transcendent value, which is, I think, a logical argument. In Europe, the practical political question is not whether religious arguments can be discussed in the public sphere or whether religious organizations can be part of civil society. In Germany and Holland, with their strong Christian democratic traditions, there is no question about this. Well, in France, with all the emphasis on laïcité, one should not underestimate the strong social and political presence of Catholicism. In Britain, the Queen is head of the Anglican Church, and dissenting traditions have been important sources for the politics of the Labour Party. The practical political question in Europe today is whether Muslims can be allowed to be part of civil society as Muslims. To what extent can religious arguments based on interpretations of Islamic tradition be uttered and heard in European civil society? When one looks at the treatment of a Muslim intellectual like Tariq Ramadan, who tries to argue for a modern European Islam and for Muslim participation in democracy, this is still very precarious. Whatever one thinks about his arguments, I mean, the kind of response to it is very fanatic. The mainstream theoretical debate about civil society does not look outside of the West. In a historical essay, Ikegami has argued that Japan in the Tokugawa period had civility without civil society. About communist China, we can say that it does have various spheres of civility, as for example in what I just mentioned, Guanxi building relations, but no civil society. In response to a talk I gave last year at Renmin University in Beijing, students and faculty responded that civil society was a typical Western concept that was imposed on China. Chinese could find their own ways of creating relatively free spaces, especially in creating economic opportunity. What I think was not fully appreciated by my audience is that there is a Marxist understanding of civil society, taking the German term bürgerliche Gesellschaft, which argues that the bourgeoisie as the social locus of civil society should be destroyed in order to achieve an equal and just society. What we now have in China seems to be commercial civility and the rise of a bourgeoisie without civil society. Again, in China, religious voluntary organizations are not allowed to play the role that they have played in Europe, to shape civil society. This is particularly true for those voluntary organizations that are placed outside of the common civilization, namely those of Christians and Muslims. In India, one has a robust civil society, a lot of voluntary organizations outside of the grip of the state, and a public sphere which is also very lively, in which religious organizations play a significant role. The civility of that civil society, however, is quite doubtful. Pogroms against Muslims and to a lesser extent Christians have been a major part of political democratization in India. Come to my conclusion, Muslims seem to be the quintessential strangers in Europe and India. They are in many ways excluded from civilization, civility, and civil society. And I speak, of course, about Muslims in minority positions, as a minority in a larger society. Assimilation into the mainstream society does not always work, as demonstrated by the assimilation into Bildungsbürger of German Jews. In India, one can be totally assimilated as a Muslim, but in times of communal violence, the ultimate check is whether one is circumcised or not. The body marks who one really truly is, sincerely is. In China, Muslims are excluded from civilization and to an extent from important forms of civility, where the question of civil society does not come up. In China, the only real political problem comes up when the sovereignty of the state is challenged, like in Xinjiang. Philosophers like Salah bin Habib think that the problem of the stranger can be solved in a legal manner by inclusive citizenship rights. And of course, this is an important step. But Muslims in Europe, India, and China are citizens. It is the application of cultural concepts like civilization, civility, and civil society that is the basis of national identity, which identifies and excludes the stranger. Thank you.
People need a moment to come up with thoughts.
Anyone still awake?
Thank you for such a wonderful talk. I had a question as to why you chose Europe in your
Europe, because I think Europe, in the creation of what I call imperial modernity, plays an important part in India and China. And my research has been first on India and later on China. So I'm interested in the way Western concepts are brought into India and China and transform what one would call native traditions. I understand that some people think that Europe should be provincialized, but it's actually of universal importance in the modern period, and it's very hard to provincialize.
Does Europe not define itself basically in terms of the Islamic world?
In terms of?
Does Europe not define itself originally in terms of the Islamic world, of its interface with the Islamic world? I mean, in a sense, Muslims are the ultimate outsider, representing them.
Yeah.
We are who we are because we're not them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is an important part, but it's not.
Going back to the Crusades.
Yeah, so that's one element of historical understanding, but I think what is more crucial today is daily encounters, and so they are conceptualized in relation to history by intellectuals. But in many places, I speak really about the Netherlands and Germany. It is the daily interaction is what one has to look at.
Well, absolutely, I would agree, but nonetheless, those people who are not in touch with what the intellectuals are thinking are heirs to centuries of hostile popular depictions of the evil Turk. You know, of course, when the Ottomans were attacking Eastern Europe, this was something that was very much in the air, and I don't think people have outgrown it. I think it's still there for many people.
Yeah, I think one of the ways in which in the 19th century Europe defines itself in relation to the empire is by seeing itself as modern and advanced, and other areas as backward and therefore in need of some impulse. And a major part of that imperial world is Muslim, and through the idea of pan-Islamism, this is also seen as being connected over a long stretch of the empire. So it's different from, say, Hindus or Hinduism in the sense that there's the potential to be a political opponent of the empire. So not only backward but also dangerous, which is different from how Buddhism and Hinduism are conceptualized. So it plays a special role in the imaginaire of Europe.
Since you're here in the United States, I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on our particular situation. And as you mentioned, there are different constructions of secularism in different countries. So the Turkish model is similar in many ways to the French model. Indian secularism is a rather different thing, I think, that we see in the latest controversy regarding Wendy Doniger's book, where there's this idea of different religious communities and appealing to their hurt sentiments and those sorts of things. And then here in the United States, we have our own particular conception of secularism based on the First Amendment, obviously, and the free exercise clause, which is also quite different from France. So do you think across all of these different secularisms, this same generalization you make about Muslims as sort of the quintessential strangers, that holds simultaneously no matter what construction of secularism you're talking about in these different countries?
No, I think that what I point out is a particular role that Muslims play in a number of these imaginaires, but that is not to say that they are the only ones who can be strangers. Catholics can be strangers for a Protestant society, which was true in the beginning of the 19th century in Holland and in Britain. They are also close to home, so it's more interesting to actually think about them and to do something about them if you can. Jews obviously played an important role in this kind of thinking in many places in Europe. I think what we have now in Europe, Muslims are the major component of what is seen as strange and dangerous. And I think a lot of the debates about immigration are basically about Muslims. But that is not to say that that cannot change and divert to some other group of people who come in, Africans or Eastern Europeans.
But the situation is a little bit different, I think, in the
Yeah,
United
but
States than in France, for instance.
Yeah, no, it works out in different places in different ways. But as Fred was pointing out, there is this necessity, or there's a kind of almost a logic to define yourself in relation to. So some form of boundary maintenance, some form of saying, well, we are this because we are not that. And that there's no need to essentialize that. But it is striking that in the locations I've been talking about, the Muslims do play this role. And I think one of the reasons is that Adam Smith's point of what kind of forms of interaction are possible. So with whom can you actually marry, with whom can you eat, and so on. That these things are quite crucial.
I think I would say that Latin American plays a somewhat similar role to Islam. I mean, if you look at conservative discourses on immigration, the quintessential immigrant, the person who's bringing these diseases across the border, is usually Latin American. And in the current American imaginaire, Muslims are definitely a boogeyman, but have kind of different subordinate place. Yeah. Although it is interesting to see arguments about immigration sometimes. Well, if we don't build this wall across the southern border of the United States, all the Muslims are going to go to Mexico. Things like that, which is interesting. But I do think that Latin America, because it is our proximate other here in the United States, plays a rather different and more central role, obviously, than it would in Europe.
No, that is definitely the case. There's a very good article, a very interesting article by Aristide Solberg, who works a lot on immigration issue, which has a title something, is the Hispanic to the US the same as the Muslim to Europe, so something like that. And I think that point is well taken. I think that is correct.
So my question has to do in its first part with theory and then next with perhaps realities. But it seems like in your talk you implied that with models of secularism, the different models that we have, there's the theoretical possibility of an implicit transcendence of identity, or at least a consciousness of this transcendence. But in reality, it seems like these models for secularism also kind of create a way of using language to get around conflicts in identity. So, in essence, in your three case studies, the problem with Islam as a stranger, secularism should, in theory, remove over time the existence of a stranger. but in reality what it's doing is it's calling strangers or defining strangers along religious lines when perhaps the difference is actually coming from racial or cultural implications, but people don't want to use that language because it's couched in a very 20th century type discourse. And so secularism has kind of replaced the language that we use, and so instead of removing the stranger, it's just calling it by a different term.
Yeah, I think these terms are very connected, right? It's almost like optional. So in Europe we had a debate about immigrants that was largely based on ethnicity for a long time. So Moroccans and Turks were mentioned, and before that Spanish and Italians. And only in the, I think, late 1980s, this changed into a language of religion. So the kind of transposition from ethnicity to religion. And the debate then also shifts in because what is happening here is actually to essentialize difference. These are immutable differences, like race. When you call something ethnicity, then people can become citizens and they have an ethnic background, like all Americans, as it were. But when you speak about biological differences that are vested in race, then of course you have essentialized them. Religion has also this potential, because it's in its own discourse emphasizes immutability, as it were. It has this potential of being used as something which just defines people entirely and fixes them, as it were, in a position. So, well, these are transpositions. They have also a political meaning when you change from one thing to the other. Religion also has this element that ethnicity to some extent also has that. There was a lot of debates for example, about Turks in Europe, whether they would be loyal to the state of immigration, because they also had a double loyalty to the state of origin. Religion has something similar, that are people loyal to political identity of their citizenship, are ultimately loyal to the religious movement they are part of, or the religious leaders. An accusation you heard already in the 19th century against Catholics: are they connected to the Pope, or are they really Dutch or British or whatever? I think these things are in a way interchangeable, but their change has meaning. And so it is interesting to see when does this religious definition of immigrants in Europe comes up and replaces this more ethnic distinction. And when was race the most important element of defining people in white and black in the US, and when does culture come up? Culture as a thing that through education would be malleable or kind of changeable. These things have political consequences.
When we consider Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and when we look at the holy books, there are certain verses in all these religions of a theistic nature. And then there are certain verses of theistic nature, and then there are verses of pantheistic.
Of?
Pantheistic or Sufism.
Okay.
That's the analysis. So some scholars have begun to argue that if we focus on the pantheistic aspects of these three monotheistic religions, there may be a hope that the efforts to come up with an alliance of civilizations may in fact be achieved. Does this make sense to you?
No, I think one can basically argue anything from any of these holy books. So basically you can have any political position, which we would see as a positive interpretation in the direction of more tolerance and more inclusiveness, etc. Which we would, the two of us, definitely, I think, would think as a positive interpretation of these texts. Can be a counter argument based on other elements of that holy book to say, well, this.
So you and I may go out and try to persuade others.
Well, basically, these are just arguments, yeah, and that's why when the tradition is alive, you have these arguments, and it's really, I think, also important to take these arguments serious. So when people argue something which you find actually abhorrent or terrible, to figure out what is going on here, what people try to argue, and and actually politically go against that. But in the end, this is politics, and it's not what is available. I think almost everything is available.
So I think what you're getting at is that we define civilization by the proof texts that are used to make the arguments.
Yeah.
That's what distinguishes them.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
So
No, you go ahead, then I go there. Yeah.
So you've largely defined citizenship against identification with any subgroup within the state. I'd like to push that category with another example, the example of Russia, where you have this confessional system in the empire, where your citizenship is through your religious community, and this in some ways sort of feeds into in the Soviet state, nationalness, like where you have a nationality that's on your passport that's additional to your being a citizen of the Soviet Union or subsequently the Russian state. And I mean, if we think of this as having some things in common with, say, Indian communalism, or even in Western Europe, where you have, in effect, multiple established religions, where everyone takes religious studies classes. It might be humanist and it might be Catholic, or and so on. What could you say about conceptualizations of citizenship as being precisely through a subgroup within the state?
I think modern conceptions of citizenship in practice are always related to existing historical formations. I grew up in the Netherlands when everyone had a confessional identity, and the confessional identity was the basis of political parties, of civil society organizations, and basically everyone, the butcher, the bakery, and so a total communal organization, in fact. On the other hand, you cannot say that in the 19th century and the 20th century Holland is a non-modern society. So there are these claims from modernization theory that people have to divest themselves from, basically in the line of Adam Smith, divest themselves from all these allegiances and so on, and become strangers to each other, to be able to fully interact. I think that is it's a claim that cannot be maintained unless one thinks that one is always a stranger to another. I mean, there's a philosophical level that one is always a stranger. So I do entirely agree that one can have citizenship in a modern society in which these subgroups or religious groups, etc., play an important role. The fact of the matter is, of course, how majorities that are constituted through elections treat minorities. And I think that is, in the end, the proof of the pudding.
Yeah, so in terms of constructing identity, it seems like from what a couple of the questions have touched on is that there's
a way to construct it negatively, that is, you know, we are French because we are not Turks or we are not Muslims and so on. And then there's a sort of positive construction as well, where, you know, we are French or we are German because we are A, B, and C. And I think each one of those has implications in terms of bringing in a group like Muslims. If it's a negative construction, then it seems to me to be a lot more difficult, whereas if there's a positive construction, then it's just a matter of, you know, can you be French like, you know, we are French and so on. So I guess I'm wondering, in the cases that you were looking at, which kind of construction seems to be more dominant, and if they both sort of coexist equally, then what does the process of the inclusion of Muslims look like, you know, when it comes to combating both positive and negative constructions of identity?
Yeah, there are of course positive arguments which says that it is more civilized to include people. And there's of course also a whole history and a philosophy around the stranger, which you could, you can go back to Greek philosophy, and so there are all kinds of arguments which try to make a positive point of inclusion. And I think that the issue is to what extent these arguments are related to changing political configurations. And the immigration issue is directly related to populist politics. So the multiculturalism argument that was available in the end of the 80s till, say, the mid-90s in the Netherlands and in Germany and Britain, basically collapses under populist attacks, which gain large majority. So it's not a philosophical debate anymore, in which people say all kinds of nice things about, well, Turkish food is also nice and so on, Moroccan food is nice and whatever. But in which, say, the politics of numbers become the crucial determining factor. And so I think what we have, if we want to look at something, what we have to look at is democratic politics. What are democracies, and how do they create a demos, and not a demon? That's the way.
Definitely another effort to save Muslims being strangers. In Turkey, for instance, when you look at the findings of some reliable nationwide survey, then we ask people, how do you define yourself? Only 4% of the respondents say they are Muslims. Another 4% come up with different ethnic identities. But the remaining, a great majority of people say they are Turks, and a minority says we are Turkish Muslims. Would that happen anyway?
Well, when you ask people in the United States what they are working class or middle class, and everyone is middle class. So this is a normal survey finding in the US. So how people identify themselves is how they see themselves, how they would like to be. And Muslims, like being Christian in the US, is a positive term. It's not a negative term. It's something that you are a civilized person. To say in the US that you are an atheist, well, it's almost like a pedophile, I guess. It's a kind of dangerous position to take. So it's actually not generally being uttered. Maybe agnostic would just do in intellectual circles, but it's in many places it would just be not done. So I guess, I don't know, but I guess that in Turkey, saying that I'm a Muslim is saying that I'm a normal person. I belong here. And so it doesn't mean much. That's why I find the term pious that we have been discussing this morning kind of difficult, because pious relates to certain kind of Protestant understandings of sincerity. and someone who is actually believing in what he does. And the outward activity is a sign of the inner conviction. But most people have no inner conviction. So I don't think that is really an issue. If you ask someone in India who belongs to a Muslim community, obviously he will say, I'm a Muslim because I'm born as a Muslim. I was a Christian in India. People would ask me what I was. I said, I don't believe in anything. So, that was no matter. I mean, I'm from Holland and I'm therefore a Christian. So it's also the identification from outside is as such. So a Turk can say, well, I don't believe in all this stuff. But he still will be seen as a Muslim in Europe. So that's, I think both the inner, internal identification as part of being a normal part of society would be, I'm a Muslim. And when a Turk travels to Europe, he will be, whatever he does or does not do, be identified as a Muslim. It's almost impossible to get away from it. So, these are not free, chosen things.
Last question?
I seem to have convinced everyone.
I'm reluctant to ask. I haven't quite formulated what I would like to say because we have the time. But I guess one thought that I'm having, I'm kind of playing with right now, is when we talk about civilization and when we talk about strangers, for me it's both very compelling, but I'm left with the question of like, who are the guardians of civilization? Because it seems by talking about civilization, we almost sidestep the nation state. And of course with the nation state, we go into the theory of who is the guardian of the nation state. And so I was thinking in terms of, but it seems like we need to answer that question of, well, who defines civilization, who are the guardians of civilization, in order to find out how we create these strangers. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think, again, this is a political process, and therefore you have to see when and where this term is used. In China there was a long period in which people had doubts, which was very similar to our description of Turkey this morning, that their civilization could stand up to Western civilization. Basically the idea was to catch up with the West, we have to get rid of what we have. So there's a particular understanding of one's traditions, of one's civilization, as an obstacle to progress. That includes all the people then that belong to that society. But after a century of these kinds of ideas, we still, and we have actually a revival, as it were, of that idea of civilization in China. And now it becomes indeed again important to say, well, what we do today has a very long tradition, and we do it because of the tradition, which does define people who belong and do not belong in civilizational terms. So it's really, it's a political moment that it has to be understood to see how this term is being applied. That doesn't mean that this thing is away when political movements just want to get rid of it. It just means that it has not been taken as the positive element of one's nation, of one's nationalism. Now we see again a use of it as a positive element in nationalism. India has a very peculiar kind of use of the idea of civilization, of Sanskriti, in its idea of nationalism. So there is this idea of there is a Hindu civilization which can be defined more or less specific, more or less inclusive. But it plays a role in almost all Indian nationalism. And the question there is, what kind of conceptualization of civilization is being used in a political program? So you have a Nehru's vision of the Indian civilization is much more inclusive and has certain kinds of main characters as positive characters throughout history. And the Hindu nationalism of the Bharatiya Janata Party has another selection to say, well, this is Indian civilization and it is really Hindu, and some groups have not contributed to it, which is also an interesting way of determining who actually belongs. Is there real poetry being made by some group or something? It's really interesting how that is defined.
Thank you very much.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.